My mother stood in front of 50 guests at my father's memorial reception, tears streaming down her face, as she loudly announced to the room that I was a cold, heartless daughter who had abandoned my family in their darkest hour. My younger brother Julian stood right beside her, nodding solemnly while wiping away forced tears, basking in the sympathetic murmurs of our extended family and neighbors. To everyone in that room, I was the ultimate villain, the successful, unfeeling older sister who refused to help her grieving mother bury her own father. I stood perfectly still at 34 years old, maintaining my composure despite the heavy wave of public judgment rippling through the room. The whispers were sharp, cutting through the low hum of the funeral home's reception hall. They thought my silence was born of shame. They thought they had finally broken me, humiliating me into submissive compliance. What my mother and brother didn't know was that less than 10 minutes ago, I had stood at the front desk of Oak Ridge Memorial Park and quietly swiped my own high-limit credit card to clear the entire $18,000 funeral balance. They believed I was holding onto my money out of pure spite. But when the funeral coordinator handed me the official administrative folder as the sole payer, it contained far more than a simple transaction receipt. Tucked behind the glossy brochure was a hidden carbon copy of the intake documents and internal financial agreements signed by Beatrice and Julian just days prior. Before I reveal the dark secret hidden within that paper trail, and how it completely exposed where my father's actual life savings went, if you find comfort in stories about overcoming toxic family dynamics and standing up for your dignity, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps bring these deep personal testimonies to light. As I stared back at my weeping mother and smirking brother, a wave of cold clarity washed over me. They truly believed they had successfully trapped me into paying for their extravagance while ruining my reputation. They had absolutely no idea that their own sloppy greed had just handed me the exact evidence I needed to destroy their facade forever. To understand why that moment broke something permanent inside of me, I need to take you back to the quiet, neatly manicured Midwestern suburb where I grew up. Our house looked perfect from the outside, but inside, the emotional ecosystem was entirely dictated by my mother's toxic delusions. My late father, Arthur, was a quiet, hard-working blue-collar mechanic. He was a man who smelled of motor oil and peppermint, whose hands were permanently stained with grease from working 60 hours a week to provide for us. He loved me deeply, but he completely lacked the emotional strength to stand up to his volatile, image-obsessed wife. My mother, Beatrice, lived in constant terror of what the neighbors might think. To feed her vanity, she completely worshipped my younger brother, Julian. He was the classic golden child, irresponsible, profoundly manipulative, and incapable of facing consequences. Whenever Julian wrecked a car, failed a class, or ran up thousands in credit card debt trying to maintain a luxury lifestyle he couldn't afford, Beatrice was there to bail him out. She routinely emptied their joint savings accounts to clear his path, leaving my father to work even longer hours to make up the difference. I, conversely, was cast as the perpetual family scapegoat. Because I was independent and focused, my achievements were entirely minimized. When I graduated at the top of my class and secured a career as a senior financial auditor, Beatrice didn't celebrate. Instead, her attitude shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't just the cold, ungrateful daughter anymore. I was viewed as an emotionless, communal bank account. During his final years, as his health began to fail, my father tried to quietly protect me from Beatrice's financial bleeding. He would whisper warnings to me over the phone, telling me never to let my mother know how much money I actually made. But he was too weak to stop the toxic entitlement growing under his own roof. Beatrice and Julian fiercely resented my professional success, viewing my boundaries as a personal insult. This deep-seated resentment laid the perfect, agonizing groundwork for their ultimate act of exploitation following my father's sudden passing, and they were about to show me exactly how far they were willing to go. As my father's heart condition worsened, the atmosphere in our home shifted from merely toxic to predatory. His health decline was steady and frightening, but for Beatrice and Julian, it was nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to their comfort. While my father fought for every breath, Julian was living a lifestyle that would have made a millionaire blush, all funded by the high-interest credit cards Beatrice helped him obtain. They were drowning in debt, and instead of taking responsibility, they turned their gaze toward the one asset they could still manipulate: my father's home. Beatrice pressured my father to take out a predatory second mortgage on the house he had spent 30 years paying off. She claimed it was for emergency medical expenses, but I knew better. I saw the statements. It was to clear the mounting debt Julian had accumulated on designer clothes and useless electronics. When I raised an alarm trying to talk sense into them, I was immediately painted as the villain. Beatrice called me stingy and cold-hearted, in front of the entire extended family, telling anyone who would listen that I was a wealthy auditor who refused to lift a finger to help her dying husband because I didn't want to lose a cent of my own money. It was a suffocating, manufactured narrative. When my father was eventually hospitalized, the dynamic became even clearer. I was the one balancing a high-pressure career with 4-hour round-trip drives every single weekend. I managed his medical care, sat with him through the long, quiet hours of the night to ensure he was comfortable, and navigated the complex web of insurance claims. Beatrice and Julian, by contrast, only showed up at the hospital when they absolutely had to. Even then, their visits were brief and self-serving. They didn't come to offer him love or comfort. They came to complain about the hospital parking fees or to aggressively nag a man struggling to breathe to sign estate documents that would bypass probate court. Documents they had clearly had drafted to benefit themselves. The biting, condescending remarks from Julian were constant. He would mock my dedication, calling me a sycophant for sitting by Dad's bed instead of living my life. Beatrice treated me like a ghost, looking through me unless she needed me to pay for an expensive hospital lunch or a private room upgrade. The isolation was profound. I was acting as the only true caretaker for a man I loved, while being treated like an intruder in his own final chapters. When the inevitable phone call finally came, it wasn't a moment of shared grief. Beatrice didn't call to tell me how much my father loved me or to offer maternal comfort. She called with a voice as flat as steel, demanding to know how I planned to pay for the funeral. "Arthur died with absolutely nothing," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. "He's broke. You're the one with the big career. Fix it." What Beatrice and Julian didn't know, and what I had worked very hard to ensure they never found out, was that I was far more than just a daughter they could push around. To them, I was simply a rigid woman who played with spreadsheets. They viewed my job as some dull clerical task. In reality, I was a senior forensic financial auditor. My entire career was built on the precise skills of asset tracing, forgery detection, and corporate fraud tracking. I spent my days unraveling complex financial lies in multimillion-dollar court cases. I knew exactly how money moved, how it was hidden, and more importantly, how it was stolen. I had deliberately kept the full extent of my own success hidden from my family. They knew I had a good job, but they had no idea about the size of my investment portfolio, the equity in my home, or the discipline with which I lived. I kept my distance and my life private, shielding myself from their endless demands and their envy. I knew that if they ever realized the true extent of my financial stability, I would become their primary target, and they would bleed me dry just as they had done to my father. The critical turning point happened during my final private visit with my father, just 2 days before he passed. The hospital room was dim, the silence heavy with the weight of impending loss. My father looked at me, his eyes clouded with regret, and reached out with a trembling hand. He pulled a rusted old-fashioned key from under his pillow and pressed it into my palm. He told me it belonged to a private safe deposit box at a local credit union, one that Beatrice and Julian didn't know existed. "They're acting like vultures, Elena," he whispered, his voice cracking. "They think I'm empty, but I protected something for you. They'll come for everything, but they cannot have this." I kept that key hidden in the lining of my purse, choosing to respect my father's final days rather than initiate a financial war while he was still clinging to life. I didn't use it, and I didn't look for what was inside. I just held on to it, a promise of a truth they couldn't touch. My professional training allowed me to see through their frantic, erratic behavior with chilling clarity. I realized that their desperation at the hospital wasn't just greed. It was the panic of people who knew they were running out of time to bury their tracks. I wasn't going to fight them with emotion. I was going to fight them with the one thing they were too sloppy to account for: the cold, hard reality of the paper trail they were leaving behind. They thought they had backed me into a corner, but they had actually walked me straight into the position of power. The morning after my mother's cold demand, I didn't go to her house. Instead, I drove to a quiet, dimly lit diner on the edge of town to meet Mr. Thomas Vance. Thomas was a retired estate attorney and had been my father's lifelong best friend since their high school days. He was a tall, silver-haired man with kind eyes and a calm, grounded demeanor that instantly made me feel safe. Seeing him sit in that vinyl booth, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, provided the very first anchor of sanity I had felt since my father's passing. When I slid into the booth across from him, the emotional weight I had been carrying silently for months finally threatened to crack my stoic facade. Thomas reached across the table and placed his warm, calloused hand over mine. He looked at me with deep sorrow and said, "Elena, your father loved you more than anything in this world. He knew exactly what Beatrice and Julian were doing and it broke his heart. He felt immense guilt for his inability to shield you from their cruelty, especially toward the end." Hearing those words from a man who truly knew my father was a profound emotional validation. It completely shattered the isolation my mother had trapped me in. But Thomas hadn't just called me there to comfort me. His expression turned grave, shifting the conversation from shared grief to a concrete legal mystery. "Elena, when your mother told you Arthur died penniless, she was flat out lying," he said, dropping a bombshell that made my blood run cold. 2 years ago, I personally helped your father set up a rock-solid, active life insurance policy worth $150,000. It was specifically designated to cover his final expenses, with the absolute remainder structured to provide you with a secure inheritance. Thomas was deeply alarmed by Beatrice's frantic claims. He warned me that a massive financial crime was likely underway within my family. "They are up to something, Elena," he cautioned, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "But you must remain entirely calm. Avoid any open confrontation for now. Let them believe they are winning. Step into whatever trap they are setting and bring me the paperwork. Let me help you review it." This meeting provided me with a strategic blueprint and a trusted ally, grounding my upcoming actions in undeniable legal legitimacy. Armed with Thomas's advice, I drove to Oak Ridge Memorial Park the following afternoon for the funeral coordination meeting. I walked into the pristine, carpeted administrative office to find Beatrice and Julian already deeply engaged in an elaborate performance of public grief. Beatrice was draped in dramatic black lace, weeping loudly into a handkerchief, while Julian paced the floor with an expression of performative exhaustion. They were treating the tragic loss of my father as a theatrical stage, selecting the most ostentatious and premium funeral packages available. They demanded a solid mahogany casket with brass handles, an elite catered reception with top-tier menu items, and custom floral arrangements that would fill the entire chapel. When the funeral director completed the itemized list and presented the final invoice, the total came out to a staggering $18,000. Right on cue, Beatrice let out a theatrical gasp and staged a dramatic fainting spell, collapsing gracefully onto the leather sofa while fanning her face. Julian immediately sprang into action, turning his aggressive focus onto me. He cornered me in the quiet marble lobby, his face reddening as he spoke in a harsh, forced whisper that easily carried across the room. "Look at what you're doing to Mom, Elena," he hissed, gesturing wildly. "Dad deserves a dignified send-off, but you're standing there like a statue. We are completely bankrupt from his medical bills and we don't have a dime. Do you honestly want to dump our own father in a pauper's grave just to save a buck? You need to pay for this right now." They were intentionally making a loud, embarrassing public scene to shame me into submission in front of the funeral home staff. But instead of getting defensive, I felt a surge of cold, professional detachment. I looked at Julian's furious face, then at my mother peeking from behind her handkerchief, and I realized this was the exact moment to step into the trap. "I will pay the entire $18,000 balance right now," I said calmly, pulling my high-limit corporate card from my wallet. Julian's eyes lit up with immediate, triumphant greed. "But," I continued, my voice steady and firm, "I have a strict, non-negotiable legal condition. Since I am the sole payer, all original intake files, historical correspondence, and internal financial disclosure documents associated with this account must be handed directly and exclusively to me." Blinded by their immediate victory and the sheer relief of avoiding an enormous bill, Beatrice and Julian didn't hesitate. They didn't even bother to read the formal authorization waiver the director printed out. They just eagerly scribbled their signatures to finalize the transaction. They believed they had successfully bled me dry once again. They had no idea that by signing that waiver, they had legally authorized the funeral home to hand me the keys to their own destruction. The day of my father's funeral was a masterclass in calculated alienation. Even though my credit card had cleared the enormous balance, ensuring every single aspect of the premium service went off without a hitch, Beatrice and Julian treated me like an unwelcome stranger. When the immediate family was called to line up for the procession, my mother coldly informed me that the front cars were reserved for those who were truly present during Arthur's final days. I was forced to sit 3 rows back in the chapel, completely isolated from the immediate family, while Julian and his wife took center stage, weeping loudly for the benefit of the gathered crowd. The true betrayal, however, peaked during the crowded memorial luncheon immediately following the burial. 50 of our closest relatives, neighbors and church members were seated around large circular tables, eating the premium catered food I had paid for. Halfway through the meal, Beatrice stood up at the head table to deliver a speech. The room fell silent, expecting a moving tribute to my father's quiet, hard-working life. Instead, my mother turned the microphone into a weapon of public execution. She began by loudly praising Julian, crying about how her wonderful son had carried the immense financial and emotional weight of this family through our darkest hours. She looked directly at Julian, who nodded with a look of practiced humility. Then her eyes shifted across the room, locking directly onto me. Her voice dropped, carrying a venomous sigh through the speakers. "It is a tragedy," she said pointedly, "that some wealthy children care far more about their personal bank accounts than their own parents. It breaks my heart that Arthur's own daughter turned her back on us when we needed her most, forcing her grieving mother and brother to beg for his dignity." The reaction was instantaneous. Disgusted murmurs rippled through the room. Heads turned, and suddenly 50 pairs of eyes were casting sharp, judgmental glances at me. I could hear my aunt whispering to her husband about how ungrateful I was. Across the room, Julian smirked triumphantly, raising his glass slightly in my direction. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to stand up, scream, cry, or run out of the room in shame, cementing the villainous role they had written for me. Instead, I felt absolutely nothing but a wave of cold, professional clarity. The last remaining threads of familial guilt inside me snapped cleanly. I realized with absolute certainty that I owed these people nothing. I didn't owe them my tears, my defense, or my silence. Without a word, I quietly stood up from my isolated table, leaving my untouched plate behind. I didn't look back at my mother, and I didn't acknowledge the whispers. I walked calmly out of the dining hall, down the carpeted corridor, and straight into the funeral director's private back office. It was time to collect the promised administrative packet. The back office was completely silent, a stark contrast to the buzzing toxicity of the dining hall. The funeral coordinator looked at me with a mixture of pity and professional respect as she handed over a thick manila master administrative folder. "Everything you requested is in here, Ms. Vance," she said quietly. I thanked her, sat down at the small mahogany desk, and opened the clasp. My years of intensive training as a forensic financial auditor immediately took over. My eyes didn't just read the pages, they analyzed them. Tucked directly inside the initial intake documents was the first piece of undeniable proof: a certified copy of a life insurance assignment form. There it was, in black and white. Beatrice and Julian had quietly filed a claim and cashed out my father's $150,000 policy exactly 4 days prior. They already had the money. But the true catalyst for their absolute destruction was a loose piece of paper folded at the back of the file. The coordinator explained that Julian had accidentally left it face down in the funeral home's copy machine the day before. It was a handwritten, signed agreement between my mother and brother. In their own sloppy handwriting, they had outlined a precise plan to completely hide the $150,000 insurance payout from me. They explicitly wrote that they would claim to be completely broke, play on my guilt, and force me to pay the $18,000 funeral costs so they could split the entire insurance windfall between themselves without losing a single cent. But their greed didn't stop there. It had turned inward. As I scanned the secondary payout amendments, my eyes locked onto a massive discrepancy. Julian had secretly forged Beatrice's initials on a supplemental disbursement form, routing an extra $30,000 of the insurance money directly into his personal bank account, completely stealing it from his own mother. And the final document in the folder explained why. It was a past due collection notice from an estate management firm, revealing that Beatrice had fraudulently used Julian's social security number to clear her secret, massive casino gambling debts, an act of identity theft that had completely obliterated my brother's remaining credit score without his knowledge. They had documented their mutual fraud perfectly on paper, signing their names to their own crimes. A deep sense of relief and absolute bulletproof vindication washed over me. My grief was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I pulled out my phone, quickly scanned every single document into an encrypted PDF file, and sent a copy straight to Thomas Vance. I realized I didn't even need to actively punish them. Their own vicious, unchecked greed had created a perfect trap. They had turned themselves into ticking time bombs, and I was about to walk back into that dining hall and pull the pin. I walked back into the memorial hall with my tablet tucked under my arm, my posture upright and my expression completely unreadable. The room was still thick with the residual tension of my mother's speech, the guests casting low, uncomfortable glances in my direction as I approached the AV booth near the head table. The automated projector was currently looping a gentle, pre-recorded slideshow of my father's early years. Without saying a word to the technician, I unplugged the facility's thumb drive and connected my own tablet directly to the multimedia system. The screen behind the head table flashed, instantly replacing a vintage photograph of my father with a massive high-definition scan of the $150,000 life insurance assignment form. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Spoons clicked against porcelain plates as people stopped eating, their heads turning toward the screen. Beatrice and Julian both froze, their faces draining of color as they stared at the official corporate seal of the insurance company displayed in bright light above them. I walked over to the podium, picked up the wireless microphone and tapped it twice. My voice when I spoke was entirely calm, measured and stripped of all emotional distress. I'd like to clarify the narrative regarding the financial burden my family has supposedly carried, I said, my words echoing clearly through the speakers. My mother just informed you all that I left them bankrupt and forced them to beg for my father's dignity. So, I think it's only fair that we look at the official audit trail of this past week. I swiped the tablet screen. The projector zoomed in on the handwritten, signed agreement between Beatrice and Julian, dated 4 days prior. As you can see, my mother and brother successfully cashed out my father's $150,000 policy before the funeral even began. They explicitly documented their plan to hide these funds from me, simulate a financial crisis, and manipulate me into paying the $18,000 funeral bill so they could pocket the entirety of the inheritance. Gasps erupted from the tables. My aunt's mouth dropped open. Neighbors began whispering furiously. Julian slammed his hands on the table, standing up to scream at me, but I didn't give him the chance. I swiped the screen again. But the greed in this family doesn't stop there, I continued, pointing to the secondary disbursement form. Julian, if you look closely at the third page, you'll see where you forged your own mother's initials to secretly route an extra $30,000 of her share directly into your personal account. Beatrice's performative tears instantly vanished. She snapped her head toward Julian, her eyes wide with feral shock. You did what? She shrieked, her voice cracking. And Julian, I said, transitioning to the final document, before you defend yourself, you should know that your mother used your social security number and forged your signature to clear $45,000 of her hidden casino gambling debts, completely destroying your credit profile without your consent. The room erupted into absolute chaos, but it wasn't directed at me. The false unity they had manufactured to humiliate me completely disintegrated in a matter of seconds. Blinded by their mutual betrayals, Beatrice threw her glass of water directly into Julian's face, screaming that he was a thief, while Julian lunged across the table, shouting that she had ruined his entire financial future. The guests watched in absolute horror as the two golden pillars of the family engaged in a screaming, unhinged physical altercation over their mutual thefts right over the memorial linens. I stood at the podium looking at the wreckage of my birth family with a sense of profound detachment. I turned off the microphone, unplugged my tablet and walked down to the head table one last time. I looked at both of them through the noise and delivered my final, unshakable boundary. I am officially removing my name, my money and my life from this family, I said softly, though they both heard me. You can tear each other apart for the scraps of your lies, but you will never use me as your scapegoat again. We are entirely done. I turned my back on the screaming and walked out into the afternoon sun, leaving them to consume themselves. The fallout from that afternoon was instantaneous, severe and entirely self-inflicted. By choosing to expose the truth through an undeniable paper trail rather than engaging in an emotional screaming match, I had set off a legal and social domino effect that Beatrice and Julian were completely unequipped to handle. They had spent their entire lives protecting a pristine public image at my expense, but within 24 hours that image was permanently shattered. The social ostracization was absolute. The extended family members, neighbors and church friends who had blindly whispered against me at the luncheon were utterly horrified by the depth of my mother and brother's depravity. They had desecrated my father's memory to execute a petty financial scam. Nobody would take Beatrice's phone calls. Neighbors avoided her on the street and the local community completely cut them off. Legally, their mutual greed trapped them in a perfect administrative gridlock. Consumed by rage over the stolen $30,000, Beatrice attempted to file grand theft and forgery charges against Julian with the local police department. However, the moment she sat down with an investigator, she was coldly informed that launching a formal criminal investigation into the insurance funds would require a full disclosure of the estate's assets, which would immediately expose her own fraudulent use of Julian's identity to clear her gambling debts. They were mutually assured destruction personified. Neither could punish the other without sending themselves to prison. Furthermore, the insurance company's compliance department, having received the digital files I forwarded to Thomas Vance, immediately flagged the entire $150,000 disbursement. They halted all pending transfers and launched an intensive internal fraud investigation due to the conflicting paperwork and forged signatures. The money they had sacrificed their souls to steal was completely frozen in a legal vacuum. The consequences quickly bled into Julian's personal life. His wife, utterly humiliated by the public exposure of his criminal behavior and realizing that the expected influx of wealth was nothing but a mirage built on fraud, packed her belongings within 48 hours. She took their children and promptly filed for a contested divorce, citing financial deceit. Without my income to exploit and with the insurance money tied up in a fraud investigation, the financial house of cards collapsed entirely. Beatrice was forced to put the family home up for immediate sale to stave off foreclosure from the second mortgage. Because of the rushed timeline, she had to sell it at a massive loss to a corporate investor. She ended up moving her remaining belongings into a bleak, cramped one-bedroom apartment on the industrial side of town, completely broke, entirely isolated, and utterly broken by the very system of greed she had spent decades nurturing. 3 months passed in absolute, blissful silence before the predictable cycle of toxic hoovering began. Once the dust had settled, their assets were frozen, and the reality of their self-inflicted isolation truly set in. Beatrice and Julian tried to claw their way back into my life. Facing imminent eviction from her bleak apartment, my mother began leaving long, weeping voicemails on my phone. Her tone had completely shifted from the venomous rage of the funeral to a fragile, trembling performance of maternal desperation. She claimed she was entirely innocent, a helpless victim of Julian's slick manipulation, and she begged me to pay her monthly rent out of filial duty to a grieving, lonely widow. Days later, Julian's attempts began. His approach alternated erratically between aggressive entitlement and pathetic desperation. He sent text messages threatening to sue me for defamation, blaming me entirely for his ruined credit, his upcoming divorce, and the destruction of the family. When those threats met my wall of silence, he pivoted, sending frantic paragraphs begging for a $5,000 loan to prevent the repossession of his vehicle so he could commute to a new entry-level job. I handled this entire onslaught with absolute, professional detachment. The little girl inside me who used to beg for their approval was officially gone, replaced by a mature woman who understood her own self-worth. I didn't engage in emotional debates, I didn't return a single phone call, and I didn't send a single penny. Instead, I quietly logged every message, took screenshots of every text, and forwarded the entire digital catalog to Mr. Thomas Vance. Thomas acted swiftly. He drafted a formal ironclad cease and desist order and had it personally served to both Beatrice and Julian. The document explicitly stated that any further attempts to contact me, direct or indirect, would result in the immediate filing of criminal harassment charges, backed by the comprehensive forensic file of their documented insurance fraud and identity theft. The threat of prison was the only language they truly understood. The boundaries held, the messages stopped, and I successfully locked the door on my past, refusing to ever step back into the role of their scapegoat. Today, I am sitting on the back porch of a beautiful sunlit home in a peaceful coastal town hundreds of miles away from the toxicity of my childhood. The air here is clean, filled with the gentle scent of salt water and pines. My life is no longer defined by the heavy, suffocating anxiety of trying to fix people who only wanted to exploit me. Instead, my environment is filled with my chosen family, genuine, supportive friends, colleagues who respect my intellect, and Thomas Vance, who still calls every Sunday afternoon just to check in on me. Professionally, my life has thrived exponentially. Free from the constant emotional drainage of my birth family, my focus and clarity reached new heights. Last month, I was officially promoted to Director of Forensic Audit at my firm, an achievement I celebrated with people who truly rejoice in my success. Shortly after moving, I finally used that rusted key my father had slipped me in the hospital to open the private safe deposit box at the credit union. Inside there were no millions. There was a simple handwritten letter from him, apologizing for his weakness, alongside a small collection of my childhood drawings he had secretly saved for decades, and a modest savings bond he had quietly accumulated out of his mechanic wages just for me. He hadn't left me a fortune. He had left me the proof that I was loved by the only person in that house whose heart was pure. I keep that letter framed on my desk, a gentle reminder of his true spirit. Looking back, I realize my victory was never about petty revenge. I didn't have to break the law, scream, or become cruel to win. True emotional justice was achieved simply by standing firmly in the truth, practicing patience, and allowing their own corruption to consume them while I chose dignity and walked away. To anyone watching this who is currently trapped in the painful cycle of a toxic family dynamic, please remember this. You do not owe your peace, your hard-earned success, or your future to people who only view you as a resource to deplete. When they demand that you pay the price for their deceit, the ultimate, most powerful act of justice is to let them drown in their own paper trail, while you step forward into the beautiful, unburdened freedom of your own new life.